Hello everyone. Today I, Harris, Agam, Claire, and Simran will discuss a critical and deeply troubling issue: the forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. This practice, which involves the involuntary removal of women's capacity to reproduce, has been reported globally and primarily targets women from marginalized communities, including racial minorities, those with disabilities, and those living in poverty. Moving on to the introduction, in Canada, the forced sterilization of Indigenous women has roots in colonial era and was significantly influenced by many movements and policies. Disturbingly, reports of such cases have continued even into the 21st century. The Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights has gathered testimonies from survivors, which we will be seeing later. This also revealed a consistent pattern of these procedures being conducted without proper consent or notice. Medical staff frequently did not obtain consent, inform patients only after the procedure, or coerce them into agreeing. These actions moving on to the procedure or coerce them into agreeing. These actions highlight a severe violation of personal autonomy and human rights, reflecting ongoing systematic issues within the healthcare system.
Let's begin by exploring the historical context of forced sterilization practices in Canada. During the early 20th century, the eugenics movement sought to improve the genetic quality of the population by preventing undesirable traits from being passed on. This ideology led to the implementations of laws like Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928, which allowed sterilization without consent for those deemed mentally defective. Unfortunately, these policies disproportionately targeted marginalized groups, including Indigenous women, reflecting systemic racism and colonial attitudes. Similar laws in British Columbia also had devastating effects on Indigenous communities. Let's begin by exploring the historical. Moving to the present, cases of forced sterilization have been reported as recently as 2019. Indigenous women continue to be disproportionately affected, often sterilized without proper consent, sometimes even immediately after childbirth. Alberta's Sexual Sterilization Act, which was repealed in 1972, established a eugenics board to order sterilization based on subjective judgments, targeting vulnerable groups including Indigenous people, immigrants, and those with disabilities. The legacy of these policies still affects survivors and their communities today, with many dealing with trauma and profound violation of their bodily autonomy. Moving.
Here are the testimonies presented to the Standing Senate Committee on Human Rights. Nicole Rabbit was sterilized while her hands were restrained, right after delivering her baby and while her abdomen was still open from the C-section and her arms tied down. The medical staff pressured her to make a decision, claiming the procedure was reversible. She said, "No one asked me what I wanted. No one explained to me why I apparently needed this done, and I didn't sign any forms." An anonymous survivor underwent tuber ligation without being properly informed about the procedure. She asked the medical staff what a tuber ligation is, and the answer she got was very vague and cruel. She said, "They explained to me that they cut my fallopian tubes and seared them closed, and made a joke about how nothing would be getting through them." Sylvia Takano testified that she was sterilized while protesting and crying. She was forcefully taken into another room shortly after giving birth, and when she sensed something wrong, she felt terrible fear and tried to protest. She said, "During this, I kept saying, 'No, I don't want to do this,' and crying uncontrollably, but nobody listened to me." The impact of forced sterilization is severe. Survivors often face significant depression and anxiety, sometimes leading to suicide attempts. The loss of identity as a woman and the ability to have child impact the survivors' mental health, as well as their communities and families. It affected their marriages and future relationships. Racism is a driving factor in forced sterilization, especially within healthcare settings. Medical staff act on their stereotype, biases, and possibly hatred toward Indigenous people and make decisions based on their personal prejudice. Also, the lack of Indigenous staff in hospitals leads to translation issues and feelings of oppression among Indigenous women. This racism is rooted in colonial history, particularly the eugenic laws of the 1930s. Such discrimination is embodied deeply in institutions like hospitals, influencing medical staff's action. Forced sterilization violates Canadian and international rights and policies regulating healthcare professionals. In 2018, the UN Committee expressed their concern over ongoing reports of forced sterilization and recommended investigation of these cases. In response, Canada acknowledged that forced sterilization is a crime in the country and the medical care requires consent in all provinces and territories in Canada. In 2019, an advisory committee on Indigenous women's well-being was established by ISC, which stands for Indigenous Services Canada, to provide advice on issues regarding sexual and reproductive health. Additionally, in January 2020, ISC collaborated with the National Collaborating Center for Indigenous Health and facilitated a forum on Indigenous women's health, including a mandatory training on anti-racism for healthcare providers.
Good day everyone, today I will discuss the ethical implications of the forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. This deeply troubling practice has violated human rights and ethical standards, causing immense harm to those affected. To fully understand the moral dimensions of the issues, I will examine it through the three primary ethical frameworks: deontology, altruism, and virtual ethics. Deontology, rooted in the work of Immanuel Kant, emphasizes duty, rules, and the inherent rights of individuals. According to Kantian ethics, actions are morally right if they adhere to established rules and respect to the autonomy and dignity of the individuals. The forced sterilization of Indigenous women violates several key deontological principles. First, it directly contravenes the principle of respect for autonomy. Every individual has a right to make informed decisions about their own bodies without any coercion or deception. In many cases, Indigenous women were sterilized without their consent or under duress, representing a blatant disregard for their autonomy and bodily integrity. Secondly, it violates human rights. It emphasizes adhering to universal moral laws and human rights. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom protects individuals from unwanted interference with their bodies and reproductive rights. Forced sterilization is a clear violation of these rights and constitutes a serious ethical breach. Third, it fails to meet the duty of care that the healthcare professionals owe their patients. Medical staff who performed forced sterilization didn't act in the best interests of their patients. Instead, they caused harm, violating the core deontological principle that one should not act to do no harm. Utilitarianism, articulated by John Stuart Mill, focuses on the consequences of actions and seeks to maximize overall happiness and well-being. From the utilitarian perspective, the forced sterilization of Indigenous women can be analyzed in terms of its outcomes. Firstly, let's consider the harm versus the benefit. The negative consequences of the forced sterilization are profound and far-reaching. Survivors experience fear, psychological stress, loss of identity, and inability to bear children, which impacts their personal happiness and well-being. These harms far outweigh any perceived social benefits, making the practice ethically defensible from a utilitarian viewpoint. Second, forced sterilization affects not only individual women but also has a detrimental impact on Indigenous communities. The inability to have a children disrupts family structures, strains relationships, and can lead to erosion of cultural and community bonds. This redistribution results in a net decrease in overall health and well-being. Third, The long-term consequences of forced sterilization include ongoing mental health, broken families, and the increase of systematic racism and inequalities. These outcomes contribute to a cycle of suffering and disadvantage that can further undermine the well-being of indigenous communities. This increase in suffering caused by these practices result in significant decrease in overall happiness, making it clear that forced sterilization cannot be justified from a utilitarian perspective. Virtue ethics, drawing from Aristotle's philosophy, emphasizes the development of moral character and the pursuit of virtue such as justice, compassion, and respect. Analyzing forced sterilization through the lens of virtue involves assessing the character and intentions of those involved. First, medical professionals who carried out forced sterilization demonstrated a lack of compassion and empathy toward their patients. It values the cultivation of these virtues, and the absence of such qualities in this context highlights the moral failings of the responsible. Compassion and empathy are essential virtues for healthcare providers, and their absence is significant ethical failure. Secondly, the systematic racism and discriminatory practices that underpin forced sterilization are anti-ethical or to the virtue of justice. Virtue ethics emphasizes the importance of justice and fairness. By targeting indigenous women, these practices perpetuate social and racial inequities, violating the principles of virtue ethics. Justice requires treating individuals with fairness and respect, and forced sterilization represents a profound injustice. Third, healthcare providers are expected to embody moral integrity, to act in ways that promote the well-being of their patients. The actions of those who performed forced sterilizations reflect a profound breach of moral integrity. Instead of upholding ethical standards, they prioritized discriminatory beliefs and practices over the health and rights of patients.
In light of these issues, we propose several recommendations to address and prevent forced sterilization. First, we must strengthen protection for reproductive rights and ensure strict consent protocols are implemented in healthcare settings. Legal reforms are also necessary, including enacting laws to prevent non-consensual sterilization and providing legal recourse for victims. Furthermore, healthcare practices must be culturally sensitive and ethical, with education for healthcare professionals on the importance of informed consent and respect for patients' autonomy. These steps are crucial in safeguarding the rights and well-being of all women, particularly those of marginalized communities.
To conclude, the forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada represents a profound ethical violation. Though through the lens of deontology, it contravenes fundamental principle of autonomy, human rights, and duty of care. Utilitarianism highlights the extensive harm and suffering caused, far outweighing any supposed social benefits. From a virtue ethics perspective, these actions demonstrate a stark absence of compassion and justice. Some of the major recommendations we see before is the legal reforms to criminalize forced sterilization and enforce strict consent laws, mandatory cultural competency and anti-racism training for healthcare providers, implementation of clear institutional policies and support system for survivors, public awareness campaigns and inclusion of this history in medical education, active collaboration with Indigenous communities to ensure their voices are integral to policies development and implementation. Finally, a small call to action. By implementing these measures, we can work towards preventing future violations, ensuring justice for those affected, and upholding the reproductive rights of all women in Canada. It is imperative to recognize and address these human rights violations to foster a more just and equitable society. Thank you for your attention. I hope this presentation has highlighted the urgent need to address the forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada and inspired you to advocate for necessary changes in our healthcare and legal systems. Thank you.